Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to former CIA official Dan Hoffman about the Russia-Ukraine war and whether Ukraine's surprising offensive campaign in Kursk could reshape the conflict. Then we dive into Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Kyiv, the civil war in Sudan, new details on Iran's coordinated hacking effort to disrupt the U.S. election, and whether America is ready for a nuclear clash with China. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A lot of fast-moving developments here at home and all around the world, including in the Russia-Ukraine war. And we're going to have Dan Hoffman coming up later on the show to help us break that down and answer some important questions about where that war is going. But before we get to that, as always, Guy, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here on the podcast, as always. The first thing I'm tracking actually involves Ukraine. It's Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit in recent days to both Poland and Ukraine. Modi headed to Kiev to meet with Volodymyr Zelensky roughly a month after traveling to Russia for what was a very chummy meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. This is all very interesting because it comes at a moment when the world wonders whether any world leader has the characteristics necessary to lead or spur eventual negotiations or peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Remember that while India is a democracy, it always pursues a kind of geopolitical non-alignment or tries to be neutral, much to the chagrin of the United States. India, under Modi, is widely considered to be a strategic partner of Russia, despite having very close relations with Washington and standing as the world's largest vibrant free democracy in terms of population numbers anyway. Modi held talks this past Thursday with his Polish counterpart Donald Tusk in Warsaw en route to Kiev for the Ukraine visit that coincides with major speculation that the recent seizure of Russian territory by Ukrainian military forces gives Ukraine long-desired leverage in any potential peace negotiations with Moscow. Russia has made it clear it won't participate in such negotiations if they're led by the U.S. or by Ukraine or by NATO. So India is not in NATO. China, which is essentially backing Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, has tried to push negotiations, but that makes the West very uneasy. So we're tracking Modi at Threat Status to see if he can spur some kind of ceasefire talks. One other thing to note on this is that Modi claimed ahead of his trip to Poland that he sees Poland, a NATO member and Ukraine's major neighbor to the West, as India's key economic partner in Central Europe. On another front, Ben, I, like you, am tracking how national security and world affairs intersect with the U.S. presidential election. So I've been keeping an eye on the Democratic National Convention this past week. I'll get into some thoughts about that later in my thread of the week. But for now, I want to point out that the DNC has been decidedly void of foreign policy proclamations on Ukraine, on China, the Israel-Hamas war. The issue of Israel's campaign in Gaza is hugely divisive for Democrats. However, there were some relatively minor clashes between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian protesters and police outside the DNC in Chicago. I want to switch, though, to something not in the news very much that I think deserves attention, and that is the horrific civil war in Sudan. I've brought this up in past episodes, Ben. Sudan is a country in the northeast of Africa where proxy activity and great power competition between the U.S., China, Russia, and other middle powers like India is pretty rampant. The war also has deep religious, mainly Muslim and Christian, clash elements and ethnic and tribal elements. And right now, it's one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters. Over the past year and a half, roughly 10 million people inside Sudan have been displaced, and millions have been pushed to the brink of starvation. I don't typically do this, Ben, but I want to read a couple of lines from a recent New York Times Magazine article about the war in Sudan that was written by journalist Nicholas Casey. I'm sure that some listeners shut their ears off at the mention of the New York Times, but I'm telling you, as a journalist who's done war correspondence, Casey's article is just great on the ground war correspondence because it has sections that expose the sad impact of war on real people in Sudan in a way that might spur readers to reflect maybe on how and why wealthier nations could or should do something, or maybe just on how lucky you may be as a human not to be stuck in such a war. At one point, Casey visits a hospital run by a German NGO in the Nuba Mountains, where he comes across a young woman caring for twin babies. A nurse explains that the babies were born prematurely, but their mother, a teenager, went into convulsions after a cesarean section and died on the operating table. Casey writes that the woman caring for the twins on the day he was there was 29-year-old Sumaya Hassan, the twins' grandmother. This is what he writes, quote, "I introduced myself to Sumaya and offered my condolences. She told me she was now worried about the twins. The grandmother was breastfeeding her own infant now, but the premature twins were refusing to take her milk. They would need baby formula, but she could not afford any. Sumaya, resigned, said the twins might die soon too." The forgotten war in Sudan, we try to draw attention to it in the Threat Status Daily newsletter and highlight developments, including an effort by U.S. and Saudi diplomats this month to try and spur peace talks in Switzerland between a rebel militia and Sudanese military forces. Those talks ultimately went nowhere.
It's a tragic situation, and it is a stark reminder, and we try to cover this at Threat Status as best we can, that there are conflicts and humanitarian crises just raging all over the world, and a lot of them don't get nearly the attention that they should. You know, Guy, last week we talked with Michael Rubin of the American Enterprise Institute a lot about Iran and its nuclear program, its goals in the Middle East, the axis of resistance that it's assembled, the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, militias in Iraq and Syria, which essentially helped do Iran's bidding to attack the U.S. and Israel, to generally act as an extension of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps without, in theory, directly implicating the IRGC or the Iranian government. We're getting more information now on an almost daily basis about how Iran seems to have taken that same model, an operation covertly directed and controlled by the IRGC, but one in which the Iranian government tries to keep an arm's length, and extended it to the cyber world. Its hacking operations targeting the U.S. are getting more advanced, more coordinated, more sophisticated, and potentially harder to stop. So how is Iran doing it? How is the IRGC perpetrating what is now a very coordinated, apparently well-funded cyber campaign? There's a look behind the curtain, courtesy of Ryan Lovelace, friend of the show and Washington Times reporter. He has a news story on how U.S. tech companies have compiled extensive data documenting the alleged Iranian hackers' attempted cyber attacks on all facets of the U.S. election system. For example, to hack into presidential campaigns themselves, Iran is using hackers alternately identified as Mint Sandstorm, Charming Kitten, APT-35, APT-42. These are groups that the intelligence community says targeted the campaigns of Donald Trump and of Joe Biden earlier this year. Now, there's also separate groups of hackers affiliated with the IRGC, allegedly, targeting governments in swing states. Why? Well, presumably to cast doubt on election results, to maybe hack into voting machines, produce fake returns that make Americans distrust the entire process, maybe just to shut the whole thing down on election day. Probably some combination of all of those things. And perhaps most sinister of all are efforts to misinform American voters. Now, Ryan Lovelace reports that that is the task of the International Union of Virtual Media and another hacking group called Storm 2035. Apparently, these Iranian hackers, they're creating long-form articles for websites, posing as liberal and conservative news outlets, generating content for social media under disguise. The content includes the election, the conflict in Gaza, even Israel's presence at the Olympics. So in some ways, Guy, part of that is a little bit reminiscent of what we've seen Russia-linked hackers do in the past.
It's totally interesting, Ben, because if I can stop you just for a second, I mean, you and I both regularly talk to a network of sources, intelligence sources, U.S. intelligence sources, national security sources that are pointing out that there's this growing cyber and disinformation and hacking connectivity between Iran and other adversarial nations or autocratic or authoritarian nations, specifically China and Russia, and to some degree, North Korea. And we see like diplomatic meetings going on between these countries where statements allude to this connectivity. So I'm wondering about, the extent to which Iran is almost acting as a proxy for other nations or in concert with.
Here's the good news. This isn't being done in secret. It doesn't seem like anybody is caught off guard by this, as we were to at least some degree back in 2016. The federal government seems to be working pretty closely with Google, Microsoft, other companies like Hive Pro to get a handle on this. But really, it's a stark reminder, I think, of what we as the free world are kind of up against here. When you talk about, as we often do on the show, the axis of authoritarians, this collection of regimes, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, one of the biggest dangers is the state sponsorship of stuff like this. When you have a country's government, its military, its intelligence services overseeing and perhaps even allegedly just outright directing what essentially is a large-scale criminal enterprise. I mean, that's really dangerous for us, for allies, and really for the entire world. And speaking of Russia, we're going to get into more of the threats posed by Russia, posed by Vladimir Putin right now with our guest, Dan Hoffman.
Dan Hoffman, thank you for coming on with us. Let's start with the Ukrainian military incursion into and the occupation of Russian territory in Kursk Oblast inside Russia. Did this operation that's really feels like it's changing the dynamic of the war at this point, did this take Washington and or Moscow by surprise, actually? And what's your thinking on where it goes from here?
Well, I think it definitely took the Russians by surprise, and those are Vladimir Putin's FSB, that's the Federal Security Service, of which he was the director, took those guys by surprise, and the Russian military. And that's a bad look for Vladimir Putin, but this war has been all about Vladimir Putin's intelligence failures. If you look at the very beginning of the war, Putin failed accurately to assess Ukraine's will and capacity to fight. Frankly, so did we. We gave Zelensky a plane, which he refused, and said the war was in Ukraine. He needed ammunition, not a flight out. Those are just a number of intelligence failures for Putin. He failed to spot the Prigozhin mutiny, and Prigozhin got within 140 miles or so of Moscow. I mean, intelligence officers are trained to detect threats way out left of boom and then preempt them before any harm is caused. Vladimir Putin failed to do that, utterly failed to do that with the Prigozhin mutiny. When you add to the fact that there was a terrorist attack at Crocus City Mall, an ISIS attack, which is a big deal, for Russia, and demonstrates that Putin can't protect his own people from terrorists. That, coupled with this latest attack by Ukraine, where they've now taken territory, and their motives, their objectives are clear. It's destroy Russia's military capability, so they're hitting air bases right over the border, and that's good for them. They were hoping to divert some of Russia's resources. We haven't seen that yet. The Russians haven't been transferring forces from Donbass. But now the Ukrainians have captured Russian conscripts who Putin said wouldn't have to fight on the front lines against Ukraine, but they kind of got stuck there. And Ukraine has territory. So if we get to the point where there are negotiations for a peace deal, Ukraine can trade Russian territory for peace instead of their own. And that's also an extremely critically important development.
I understand your point about this Ukraine weighing the risks here and now having leverage that was previously non-existent in any potential ceasefire negotiation or territorial negotiation to end the war. But doesn't Ukraine's cross-border move into Russian territory risk an escalation going forward here, especially at a delicate political moment back in Washington? The U.S. election is coming. Are we walking into a situation where Moscow might be expected to retaliate hot and heavy by pounding Ukrainian civilian targets over the coming weeks or months.
But I think that's what they've been doing for 2.5 years, killing innocent Ukrainians, raining down hell on maternity wards and hospitals and Ukrainian infrastructure. Ukraine is fighting an existential war here for their survival. So this is what they've got to do. And it's when you're going up against a dictator like Vladimir Putin, you take the fight to the enemy, and that's what they're doing. So I think their strategy makes sense. I'm not really worried about escalation. I'm worried about Ukraine defending themselves and eventually ending the war on their terms. And what they're also doing, Guy, look, in Russia, there's this thing called vertikalnaya vlast, vertical power. That's what Putin talks about all the time. Every single success is his, and every failure is going to be blamed on somebody else. So he'll do that. In this case, he'll blame it on his military commanders and FSB officials. Remember, he threw one of his senior FSB guys, Sergei Besieda, in jail after the initial defense that Ukraine made of Kyiv back in 2022. And that was over his Besieda's failure to collect intelligence. Of course, he's just a scapegoat. So you're causing dissension potentially within the ranks. And Ukraine's message behind the scenes to senior Russian military intelligence, national security officials, Kremlin insiders is, hey, Vladimir Putin's lost a few miles off his fastball, and maybe he's not the right guy to be running things from the Kremlin.
But so is Putin under pressure at this point from his internal supporters for failing to stop Ukraine's operation in Kursk, and then now being pretty slow to retaliate?
What we're seeing first is why the CIA has put out 4 recruitment videos, because they're recruiting Russians. So we're seeing that for sure, that senior Russian officials, Russian intelligence officers and others are dissatisfied with the fact that Putin launched the war in the first place. They see the truth about the war, which is that Putin has spilled a massive amount of blood and treasure. You've got 1 million or so Russians that have fled in a huge brain drain. Sweden and Finland are now NATO members, and Europe is awakened from a post-Cold War slumber, ready to defend themselves. Russians might like to send their kids to schools in Europe or, take vacations there, and they don't get to do that anymore. So behind the scenes, bubbling to the surface, perhaps, we're seeing that dissatisfied people who are vulnerable to being recruited by the CIA, FBI. Whether they take it to the point where they run the risk of trying to remove Vladimir Putin, if it becomes an existential threat to their lives, I don't know whether we're going to get to that point in the near term, but that's the risk Putin runs. And the more he runs the risk, perhaps to get to your point about escalation, the more risks he's willing to take to stay in power. And when he does that, his own people see it and they think, well, we don't like some of the risks he's taking. We wish he wouldn't. And that's where you get, potentially at least, Putin's removal, if that's the way things go.
Dan, I'm curious how this operation, the Ukrainian operation in Kursk, is playing sort of around the world in the U.S. and across Europe. Do you get the sense that, I guess, number one, here at home in the U.S., does this help or hurt the prospects for more continued American aid, military financial aid to the Ukrainians? And conversely, also, I guess, across Europe, are other NATO countries, are they comfortable with this, with the idea of Ukraine holding Russian territory? Does that give us a spark to the push to try to end this war as quickly as possible, in your view?
So let's remember one thing. The war could end right now if Vladimir Putin wanted it to end. He could just stop the war that he started, first. Secondly, I only took one class in international law, but I listened to lawyers, and they'll tell you Ukraine is every bit in the right to go attack Russia and Russian territory based on the fact that Russia attacked them first and is killing Ukrainian civilians. But where I think Europe and the United States have to be laudatory of Ukraine is that Ukraine pulled this off. They conducted military reconnaissance. That's the military intelligence in Ukraine, which is extraordinarily effective behind enemy lines. They conducted reconnaissance, and then they conducted to enable the operation that took place. I mean, this is tremendous tactical success. And every time Putin talks about red lines, he's doing it for, an information propaganda purposes, because he believes that he can influence President Joe Biden, whose formative experience, one of them was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And every time Putin talks about nuclear war and Armageddon, Biden goes back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and wants to avoid escalation and all that. I think that's a red herring. Where's the escalation? Why is everybody wetting their pants? I don't have a problem with this. Let the Ukrainians go fight their way to freedom. Let them do it.
So on the idea of the escalation, because I've just been fascinated throughout the 2.5 years this has been going on now, that seems to be the primary calculus for the Biden administration is, how do we prevent escalation? But yet we keep doing these things that end up in retrospect being a good idea. For example, we decided we're going to let the Ukrainians use US-made weapons to strike inside Russia. That turns out to have worked. So what if they had been able to do that months before? What could the tide of the war look like? So with that in mind, what should the U.S. be doing now? Is there something we can maybe use a little forethought for a change, it seems, and something we can give the Ukrainians now, or some policy change we could make now, letting them do X, Y, or Z to maybe actually kind of get ahead of this a little bit instead of constantly doing things too late?
Yeah, so we did things too late, and we're still not allowing Ukrainians to use long-range artillery like ATACMS against the Russians. We should have just said, here you go, do what you want with it, defend yourselves, and taken our hands off the steering wheel, because when they're on the steering wheel, then the Russians assume, rightly or wrongly, that we have some control tactically over Ukraine and the military options that they're choosing, which is not what we want. We should have just given them what they needed when they needed it. That's 2 years ago. And let them do with it as they please, and say to the Russians, sorry, we've given this to Ukraine. They're defending themselves. If you don't like it, stop the war. Stop allying yourselves with rogue states like Iran and North Korea and China, and the war can end. But we didn't do that, and history is not going to be kind to the Biden administration on this. We just never gave Ukraine what they needed when they needed it. So we can go back now. It's counterfactual history. What if we had done what we should have done when we should have done it? Going forward, we're still not doing what we should do. Yes, Ukraine eventually is going to get F-16s. They could have used them last summer for combined military operations. Didn't have them. Why did the counteroffensive that Ukraine had planned not work out as well as we would have liked? That's certainly a reason. But if you're really in it for Ukraine to win the war and defend their territorial integrity, then just give them the weapons and let them do what they got to do. And what's at stake here is more than just Ukraine against Russia. This is like the Spanish Civil War, the 1930s all over again. We're fighting a proxy war against Russia, arguably, but we're also fighting a proxy war against Iran and North Korea and China. All of those dictatorships are at war with us in Ukraine. We got to win.
Can we go even bigger picture, specifically with regard to China's support for Russia here? You know, I'm hearing in private conversations with other U.S. national security sources that see Ukraine as China's first major proxy war of the 21st century. China is facilitating Russia and continuing the war in order to study and probe the West's response capabilities, the viability of NATO, its resilience, the alliance, and so on. What are your thoughts on that? I know you're saying there are all these proxy wars, but with specific regard to Ukraine and China's role at this point, is this a proxy war for China?
So the question I'd ask, if I were the director of the CIA, and I'm sure the directors asked it, I would be sitting in the 7th floor conference room with all of my briefers, and I'd say, okay, remove China from this equation. And what does Russia's war effort look like? Let's just say China stopped giving Russia dual-use military equipment, stopped flooding the Russian economy with Chinese consumer goods, and stopped importing Russian hydrocarbons like they are. What would the war effort really look like? I think Europe needs to understand that China is in a proxy war against them, not just against us. So all those European countries that think that détente and finding some modus vivendi with the Chinese and doing, trading with the Chinese, understand the Chinese are enabling the Russians to carry on a war that is the greatest threat to European security since the Second World War.
So interesting, Dan. I just want to reiterate for our listeners here that Dan Hoffman is a regular analysis and opinion contributor to Threat Status at the Washington Times. His columns are always eye-opening, honest, and heartfelt. He's a great writer. He has a biography page on the Washington Times website. You can easily find it via Google. I hope people read his stuff. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
And it's now time for Threat of the Week. our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, either here at home or somewhere around the world, that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you are listening to the show. Guy, my threat of the week, and we've talked about this before as well on the show, and that's China's nuclear buildup. But now specifically the fact that we, the U.S. and the Pentagon, may not be fully prepared for a possible nuclear clash with China. Our colleague Bill Gertz this week wrote about a new report from the Center for a New American Security, a report that was funded by the Pentagon's Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which found that U.S. military forces are not ready to respond to a tactical nuclear weapon strike by China in a protracted war. The study goes into a lot of detail here about all of the reasons for that. But off the top, one of the biggest ones is the nuclear calculus in Beijing, which is probably different than in any other capital all around the world, potentially even including Moscow, Pyongyang, or other adversaries that have some nuclear capabilities. In China's case, the report found, quote, the emerging nuclear dynamics between the U.S. and China appear to have different dynamics than those between the United States and the Soviet Union and carry a greater risk of limited nuclear use, unquote. There's a few reasons for that. On the technical side, China's missile forces are configured to handle both nuclear and conventional warheads. That means there's not much of a logistical hurdle for them using nuclear weapons in a tactical setting. If they're invading Taiwan, for example, and decide that they want to swap out conventional warheads with nuclear ones, presumably at least that could be done pretty quickly and pretty easily. So that's dangerous. And there's also a strategic component here. The report found that during a theoretical war in the Indo-Pacific, perhaps over Taiwan, tactical nuclear weapon strikes would be, quote, both appealing to the People's Republic of China and difficult to manage for the U.S., unquote. Why? Well, in that region, the use of low-yield missile and bomber attacks might be really effective because of the broad ocean geography and the type of locations of targets that we're talking about. In other words, we're not talking about full-scale nuclear destruction. We're talking about the use of a relatively small nuclear weapon deployed at a specific cluster of maybe U.S. forces on an island, maybe even ships, whatever the case may be. How do we respond? Do we strike mainland China with a tactical nuclear weapon of our own? Do we spend time debating what to do and China seizes the opportunity and gets its troops ashore in Taiwan? We saw some answers this week about how we might approach it. The New York Times reported that President Biden altered the U.S. strategic nuclear plans earlier this year secretly and shifted those plans more toward countering China's nuclear arsenal and preparing for the possibility of nuclear coordination between China, Russia, and North Korea. This is one of the most highly classified documents inside U.S. national security, the Nuclear Employment Guidance. It was altered back in March, reportedly, without any public announcement. The highest levels of government seem to know the dangers here, Guy, but it's still a threat to me because I'm not convinced that even inside the White House or in the Pentagon, there's a clear understanding of exactly what the U.S. can or should do in the event that China decides to use a tactical nuclear weapon.
My threat of the week is the threat that divisive, irresponsible, accusatory, and frankly inflammatory rhetoric and politics in the U.S. presidential election are clouding the broader American public's understanding of the most basic tenets and concepts underpinning the U.S. government and the two-party system. Both the recent Republican National Convention and this past week's Democratic National Convention have been loaded with speeches that were as much, if not more, about hurling accusations in mud at the other side as they were about policy plans. An independent observer of either convention would be struck by how many speakers on both sides played fast and loose with language personally criticizing individuals on the other side, whether it's Biden, Trump, Harris, Walz, or Vance. And the notion that the United States is very beautifully both a republic and a democracy, and that the two parties may have different ways of approaching that dichotomy during four-year White House terms seems to have been lost. I'm not saying the Democrats deny the concept or importance of the republic, and I'm not saying Republicans are not democratic. I'm just saying, and this is my threat of the week, that the divisive rhetoric threatens to cloud out the very basic beauty of the U.S. system and people's ability to see it. And I'm sure there will be listeners on both sides that claim I'm totally ignorant here, that I've clearly chosen a side. I'm just trying to be an honest journalist, Ben.
Well, look, I mean, we are getting down to the home stretch of this presidential election, and less than 3 months, only 2.5 months now to Election Day. So this is going to become a bigger and bigger topic for us here in the Threat Status Podcast as we head toward November. That's for sure. So thank you all very much for listening this week. Thanks to Dan Hoffman for coming on the show. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, tell all of your friends, and we will be back here next week on the Threat Status Podcast.